Welcome to our last session for today.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Before we welcome our presenters for this afternoon, I would like to express the Institute's great thanks to the John Templeton Foundation. It is certainly through their generosity that this colloquium is possible, particularly with a grant that they've made to the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study. So we're very grateful to them. We're also grateful to Douglas Hedley, who conceived of this colloquium. And just a few words about this colloquium. Our discussion over the last 3 days has dealt with the idea of participation from the perspective of different disciplines and fields. One of the objectives of this colloquium that Douglas set in place from the beginning was that multiple, even divergent perspectives would be brought to the table. And we've had that for every one of the sessions and look forward to the divergent views that come out in this session as well. The format for this afternoon's session will be like we've had earlier. First, Douglas Hedley will offer an explanation of how this session plays a role in the larger issues he's pursuing with respect to participation. Secondly, our presenter, Celia Deane-Drummond, will present her thoughts on the topic of participation and the natural sciences. This will be followed by Douglas Hedley, who will provide a response and further commentary. And then the third and final component of this session will be the larger discussion with all of us participating. This will include an opportunity for your questions, for your comments, and as before, we ask a couple of key things when asking your questions. One, raise your hand, I'll put you on the speakers list. Two, when you get the microphone, please introduce yourself first. And lastly, when you speak, please speak loudly. Our presenters this afternoon are Celia Deane-Drummond and Douglas Hedley. Celia Deane-Drummond is a professor of theology, and she holds a concurrent appointment in the College of Science at the University of Notre Dame. She holds doctorate degrees in plant physiology, as well as systematic theology, and she is the author of numerous books, including Creation Through Wisdom, Brave New World, Theology, Ethics, and the Human Genome, Reordering Nature, The Ethics of Nature, Wonder and Wisdom, Conversations in Science, Spirituality, and Theology, Genetics and Christian Ethics, Eco-Theology, Christ in Evolution, Wonder and Wisdom, Seeds of Hope, Facing the Challenge of Climate Justice, and her most recent work, The Wisdom of the Liminal, Human Nature, Evolution, and Other Animals. She has served as chair of the European Forum for the Study of Religion and the Environment, and in 2011, Professor Deane-Drummond was awarded a senior fellowship by the Center for Theological Inquiry at Princeton University for her project focused on human nature and evolution. Douglas Hedley is reader in Hermeneutics and Metaphysics at the University of Cambridge, and he currently serves as a Templeton Fellow at the NDIAS. He specializes in Neoplatonism, the Cambridge Platonists, aspects of Romantic and Idealist thought, and the philosophy of religion. His monographs include Sacrifice Imagined, Violence, Atonement, and the Sacred, Living Forms of the Imagination, and Aids to Reflection and the Mirror of the Spirit, Coleridge, Philosophy, and Religion. He is the principal investigator of a United Kingdom Arts and Humanities Research Council grant titled Revisioning Cambridge Platonism, and he currently serves as co-chair of the Platonism, Neoplatonism group at the American Academy of Religion. Without further ado, I turn it over to Celia Deane-Drummond and Douglas Hedley.
I'd like to start with a word of thanks both to Douglas Hedley and the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study for inviting me to take part in this conference, and also to you for coming here after the fire, as it were, and your resilience in being here in spite of the somewhat acrid smell in this room. But the first comment I have is the title. I've changed the title today to something slightly different, so those of you who might have been expecting me to engage with physics may be a little bit disappointed, but this is the title I will be using. I'm calling this Playing with Participation, Notes on Creatio ex Nihilo from a Biologist turned Theologian. And unlike my normal style of delivery at conferences, I'm going to read this paper, so please be prepared, and I will do my best to keep the flow and your attention. So my comments on Douglas Hedley's fascinating paper stem from my own wrestling with the search for compatibility between evolutionary biological sciences and theological articulation of key concepts in systematic theology. How, in a secular world dominated by an evolutionary paradigm, is it reasonable to think about creation, Christ, or spirit? But domination is here an operative word, for the prevailing evolutionary view has become, in Mary Midgley's words, a metaphysical form of scientism that seems to go beyond any purely theoretical considerations about analysis of evolution according to scientific method. At the same time, there are insights about the natural world emerging from the natural sciences that need to be taken seriously. For the purposes of this talk, I'm going to limit myself to the evolutionary biological sciences. And if it was Aristotle who in some sense prepared the ground for doing that, do we also have to follow his outright rejection of Plato's idea of participation? The scholar who immediately comes to mind as someone who was able to combine Aristotelian insights about observation of the natural world alongside notions of participation is, as Hedley points out, Thomas Aquinas. But I suggest that in order to avoid any possible charge of emanation or pantheism, Aquinas sets up his doctrine of creation in opposition to Plato as Creatio ex Nihilo, thus preserving the logical distinction between God and the created world. We had something about this already from Cyril O'Regan in the way he set up his discussion earlier this morning. I suggest that Creatio ex Nihilo is important as it puts an appropriate theological and systematic limits on what can and what cannot be gleaned from either Platonic metaphysics or the biological sciences, and thus allows the concept of participation to be framed somewhat differently, and so at least avoid some of the questions raised. Christian revelation more generally resisted Plato's concept that God formed the world from pre-existing matter. Irenaeus and Tertullian extended Creatio ex Nihilo in order to maintain that the ontological distinction between God and all creation, so that nothing is certainly not something. God is therefore not on the same level of being as other creatures, and the creation of the world out of nothing seeks to safeguard this view. Simon Oliver argues that the idea of creation out of nothing is so radical that to associate it with natural processes is misleading. Rather, it needs to be linked primarily with the doctrine of God. I suggest that Aquinas' writing on the sentences of Peter Lombard illustrates not just the concept of creatio ex nihilo, but also the relationship between this and participation. And I'm going to go through this, some of these writings now in order to illustrate this point. The first article argues that while there is more than one principle at work in the world, in absolute terms there is only one principle. Evolutionary theory has, ever since Darwin, resisted the idea of non-material forces operative in the emergence of things and beings. But more recently, secular writers are beginning to open up alternatives that biologists are prepared to take seriously. Thomas Nagel, for example, in his controversial book Mind and Cosmos, and this is my only real reference to cosmology, like the authors Aquinas interrogated, is prepared to recognize a transcendent, non-material force in the world, but he rejects the idea of one absolute first cause, or that God exists. Hence, Plato's concept of dependence on a perfect transcendent source of all being, or absolute beauty, goes much further than Nagel would allow. But inasmuch as Nagel admits a transcendent source is involved in efficient causation, It amounts to a secular alternative to the materialism wedded to standard neo-Darwinian interpretations of evolution. Aquinas develops a hierarchy in the order of being, from rocks through to intelligent life and ultimately humanity. This is woven into his understanding of hierarchy of forms. Aquinas then marries this hierarchical view with a Platonic concept of an absolute being that is the ultimate source of all such being. In Aquinas, different things express being in different ways, some more nobly, others less nobly. But it is important that this does not map onto what is observed or their quiddity. So all things other than God have being that exists only by analogy to the ultimate being of God. Given the lack of material causality, the natural character of the creature is non-being. It is here that he brings in the concept of participation through analogy. As God is a prerequisite, this is inevitably in tension with a strong sense of evolutionary emergence that conflates existence and quiddity of things. In systems thinking, for example, hierarchy is an important element of what constitutes a well-functioning system, along with resilience and self-organization. But hierarchy from the perspective of the evolutionary sciences stems directly from what is observed and emergent properties. And we heard a discussion of emergent properties already this morning. The choice, therefore, in an effort to make evolutionary biology in any way compatible with theism is between a process emergent God or to retain the idea of Creatio ex Nihilo and argue for the possibility of secondary causation alongside a different kind of top-down metaphysic of being. The dominant view among theologians who are familiar with evolutionary biology is to opt for a process-oriented view of emergence. Arthur Peacock, who pressed for a top-down as well as bottom-up view, resisted process thought to some extent, but in the end his nerve failed when admitting to the liberal version of Christ's divine nature as emergent. So far, then, the puzzle remains as to how, if at all, a biological understanding of the world could ever be married in a satisfying way to classic theistic views of participation. In the third article, Aquinas does nevertheless concede that philosophically some creatures could be used as instruments to the actual creation of other creatures. In philosophical terms, this is emanationism, the power of creating to creatures. But it is not really biological evolution either, since evolution always builds on what has come before rather than generates out of nothing. Later, Aquinas changes his mind and only admits that creatures can conserve creaturely existence, rather than being a genuine source of being. One creature can, therefore, be the cause of well-being for another. He also, in the fourth article, stresses that the being of a creature, although originating from God, expresses a creature's actual existence and desire for existence. Creatures are causes in the sense of being determinants of that continued being. So here we find an elaboration of what he means by secondary causation. Namely, the substantial and accidental changes are creaturely, but God is the ultimate source of being. The formal cause, or the inner shaping principle, does not need to be directly caused by God, but by creatures themselves. Forms do not pre-exist in matter except by potential, and at the same time do not appear from nothing, as if God was a supernatural agent intervening and responsible for new forms. Creaturely becoming, therefore, presupposes creation, but involves natural agency. And I'm going to say that again because it's really important. Creaturely becoming presupposes creation, but involves natural agency. The importance of distinguishing creation from nature cannot be overstated, for it safeguards not only the discovery of real, genuine causes in the natural world, but also the possibility of free agency. Aquinas develops this thread in other works, such as his question on the power of God, which addresses the distinction between nature and creation, and where he discusses 20 possible objections, including the idea that form is imposed on pre-existing matter by supernatural agency. That those powers by which nature operates have their ultimate origin in Plato, following Plato, does not take away from the possibility of efficient causality in the natural world. In the 6th article, he lays out his theological account of creation in Trinitarian terms, so that on theological grounds, creation can be claimed as being finite and out of nothing, but God as Father is the efficient cause. God as Son is the exemplar cause, that is, that which exists in the mind of the Creator, and God as Spirit is the one who conserves creation in being. The difficulty of Aquinas' account so far is not so much its rational cogency, assuming, of course, that a metaphysical starting point is still a reasonable one to hold, but its analytical approach does not readily include a portrait of how God acts as emerging from the rest of the tradition. In other words, God as Creator also needs to be thought of as an act of divine love and wisdom. So he also acknowledges that it is, in other places, that it is wisdom through which an intelligent cause operates and therefore is specifically related to the Son, while goodness comes particularly from the Holy Spirit, who guides things in their proper end or purpose. Given that the creative act of God involves all 3 persons of the Trinity, it is logical that a trace of the Trinity is also found in creaturely beings. Platonic participation seems to be mediated here through the work of Augustine and modified in order to take up a Trinitarian theme. So Aquinas, drawing on Augustine, elaborates, and this is a direct quotation from Summa Theologia. He says this: In all creatures we find a likeness of the Trinity by way of trace, and that there is something in all of them that has to be taken back to the divine persons as its cause. For each created being subsists in its own existence, has a form which makes it the kind of thing that it is, and bears on something other than itself. The fact of it being created speaks of the Father, its form speaks of the Logos, but inasmuch as it goes out from itself, it speaks of the work of the Holy Spirit as love. Creation is therefore not so much an exercise of divine power, where power is thought of as an imposition of God on matter, but rather an expression of simple dependence. So God's sovereign purpose is what the world is becoming. Creation and grace in Aquinas' commentary on the sentences therefore works through a double movement of coming out of God, or excitus, and going back to God, redictus, so that God is the fulfillment of all life. All creatures participate in the life of God in terms of goodness, but spiritual creatures participate in the very happiness of God. The ultimate purpose at work in the universe as a whole is the final cause. The exemplar cause in the mind of the Creator is not arbitrary, but stems from God's wisdom. The configuration of forms can be traced back to its original source in divine wisdom, which contrived the world order consisting in the distinctiveness of things. And again, I'm quoting Aquinas here. Hence, we should say that divine wisdom holds the originals of all things, and these we have previously called the ideas, that is, the exemplar forms existing in the divine mind. So this parallels almost exactly what is discussed in Neoplatonic sources. Aquinas clearly wants to hold on to the idea of an analogous relationship between creatures and Creator, while maintaining that creatures are, quote, never so perfect as to be like God according to the likeness of nature. Nevertheless, they touch on his likeness. End of quote. But there's an important distinction. For creation is one that originates in a primary sense, not just ex nihilo, but also in the love of God, since it is not so much an act of need, as seems to be the case in the theories of emanation, but is supremely generous in order for creation to share in goodness. That means the ultimate purpose of creatures is a resemblance of divine fullness and excellence. So when Aquinas speaks of the power of God, it is the power to create in love and in accordance with this goal in mind. Hence, Power, and this is a quote again, power which is the supremely manifest in creation is especially the Father's, so we stress that he is creator. Wisdom, through which an intelligent cause operates, is especially the Son's, so we declare through him all things were made. Goodness is especially the Holy Ghost's, and so we acknowledge that he vivifies them and guides them things to their ends. Life is an inner spring, and the source is the end and the good. End of quote. He interprets the dynamic of the relationship between creatures and creator through the sharing in the life of the Trinity. The goal of creation is therefore drawing creation towards its own life, and its inner dynamism reflects the inner dynamism of the life of the Trinity. But now, turning back again to the evolutionary world, has this stress on the love of God and the dynamics of participation, not just in God, but in the life of the Trinity, made this even less accessible to minds honed to evolutionary understanding? In order to address this, I would like to raise three points, all of which are pertinent to coming to what I believe is a reasoned conclusion. The first is that evolutionary theory itself is based on speculation arising out of what seems to make sense when viewed through what we call a biological gaze. It is, of course, coherent within that view, and evolution by natural selection is perhaps the most dominant and most enduring hypothesis in contemporary Western society. I could say with Pope John Paul II that Darwin's approach to evolution by natural selection is more than a hypothesis, in that it is reaching the status of accepted theory. But secondly, there are other theories of inheritance that are just as important to consider in the present context. While Darwin's theory has been parsed through a genetic selection mechanisms, non-random selection through epigenetics and genetic drift, the inheritance of behavior and the inheritance of symbol making also contribute to what we term evolution, or inheritance mechanisms if you prefer. Symbol making is part and parcel of metaphysics and theology. It's also part of science. So to dismiss one form of symbol making, that is theology, on the basis of another, that is science, does not make much sense. Well, it doesn't to me anyway. Perhaps indeed there's an analogy between the two. So thirdly, we might ask, is there any analogy at all between participation in being and the idea of participation that comes to the surface in evolutionary theory, especially the newer theories I was mentioning? And the answer to this question is, I suggest, a tentative yes. One rather obvious example is that of symbiosis as emerging in evolution. The symbiosis is where each creature contributes to the life of the other in mutual dependence, and I suggest it's a form of ultimate participation. The difference, of course, in the case of the Godhead is that the participation is uneven. God does not need creatures to be God in the way that creatures express their dependence. The relationship in this case seems more metaphorical. Secondly, a closer analogy comes from viewing the process of cooperation and niche construction in the evolving history of the social species. Jeremy Kendall and his colleagues suggest this: the defining characteristic of niche construction is not the modification of environments per se, but rather the organism-induced changes in the selection pressures in environments. And so, importantly, for the present talk today, niche construction theory represents an important philosophical expansion in the way we envisage evolutionary processes working, so that some have incorporated aspects of niche construction theory in their frameworks. A more radical approach is to examine evolutionary questions under the umbrella of niche construction theory, rather than simply adding it on to previous dominant models. I think it is particularly interesting as it provides a significant bridge between biological sciences and the human cultural sciences. And let me explain a little bit more why this is the case. Standard evolutionary theory is externalist in as much as the environment is perceived as acting like external factors that then act on bodies and behaviours, selecting those internal properties of individuals and populations that are best fit to that environment, and resulting in overrepresentation of those most fit variants, In other words, adaptation. Natural selection in this view is the ultimate category that explains phenotype, including behavioural differences, and therefore devalues more proximate causes and ignores the possibilities of other evolutionary forces. Hence, standard evolutionary theory can still include niche construction theory, but the ultimate explanation is still one rooted in natural selection. In the newer approach to niche construction theory, the idea of all direct evolutionary causation through natural selection becomes problematized. So the dichotomous proximate and ultimate distinction is replaced by reciprocal causation. In this way, niche construction works with natural selection in the evolutionary process in a dynamic interchange. Niches are themselves part of the inheritance process, so that an interactionist evolutionary theory replaces an externalist theory. Niche construction emphasizes not just genetic, epigenetic, and cultural inheritance, but also dynamic interactions with other species as well. And this is an area I've become particularly interested in work I've been doing more recently. So what I'm suggesting here is that the dynamic participation in God and God's immanence in the created world is in broadly analogous relationship with niche construction theory that envisages a dynamic interrelationship between creatures in their evolutionary path. I prefer to use the language of theodrama to describe the participatory exchange envisaged, as it puts greater emphasis on agency. Participation itself can seem passive or inevitable, and so is more like the biological symbiosis, where in the end there's really no choice but to participate. The metaphysical difficulties do, to a large extent, still remain and cannot be avoided. But I suggest that using the language of analogy edges towards the meaningful in what might seem incomprehensible differences. And I think we got that from Cyril O'Regan's paper this morning. We ended up with that sense of incomprehensible difference. It's only by experimenting and speaking a language that resonates with those we are in dialogue with that a faint glimmer of insight can come to the surface. And if anthropologists like to view such theological speculation as its example par excellence of human symbol making, then so be it. We have at least started a conversation rather than being left with discarded icons. I'll finish. Thank you.
Well, Celia, thank you very much indeed. I think it's particularly appropriate that we should finish our colloquium with some reflections inspired by Thomas Aquinas. We are in Notre Dame, after all, and so this key medieval thinker for whom participation is such a central idea is obviously a good topic to end on. I was also interested in what you say about niche in terms of environment and, as you emphasized, other animals, because that actually brings up a criticism of Christians in the antique world by pagans, i.e. that Christians were absurdly anthropocentric. And so I'd be interested in hearing a little bit more about how you see Christian anthropocentrism, which of course is linked to the whole mechanics of the redemptive process, that God becomes flesh as a human being, that we as human beings are redeemed from our sinfulness through his death and resurrection. So there would seem to be built into Christianity a anthropocentric focus, which many other religions, systems of thought do not share, in fact find rather puzzling. But you seem to be wanting to modify at least this anthropocentric dimension of Christian thought. And how do you see that fitting in with the attempt to talk about participation in an intelligible way?
Shall I answer this? Yeah, thank you. In a sense, you've touched on the heart of some of the research I've been doing recently on theological anthropology that has in a different vein, as it were. So what I'm trying to do is to recover aspects of the Christian tradition that have been buried, that do not emphasize or rather replace a strong anthropocentrism with a theocentric understanding of the whole of the natural world, where we are creatures together, as it were, in relationship to God, rather than necessarily pointing just to the human in the way. And it goes back to the story of Genesis, where the crown of the creation story is the Sabbath, which is the celebration of all the creatures together rather than the human person. So the idea that we are the crown of creation is actually a mistake, even in the biblical text. So I think it's a misreading to see that there are reasons why anthropocentrism has become particularly dominant, and I think they are not just Christian reasons. There are reasons it's become dominant because the sense of community has been lost. And so the individualism that we're left with in the post-Enlightenment era is left with an individual human being. Now, what I'm trying to do in the notion of theodrama is expand Hans Urs von Balthasar understanding of theodrama. So it's not just the human community that's talked about in the drama, but it's expanded out to include other animals as well. Of course, other animals aren't agents in the same way that humans express their freedom, but there's still an agency within them, especially in some social animals. And so you have to draw on other aspects of the biological sciences as well as the evolutionary sciences to talk about this. But if you go back to the very long history of the human, and I'm sure that we have other people in this audience who can fill this aspect out in terms of human evolution. But if you look at the very long history, the history shows that human associations with other animals go back millions of years, back to the hominins and so on. So our niche construction, as it were, has been shaped by the particular dynamic niche in which we are, which includes other animals. And so therefore we should see other animals as being co-participants with us. Not in the same way, but we are part of the theodrama. And so therefore we are caught up, whether we like it or not, with the lives of other creatures. And I think it's really what you might call a shearing away of some of that understanding of participation that has been a mistake. But the reason I set the talk up in the way I have, to use the framework of creation out of nothing, is that I think that allows us to use the language of participation without any sense of fear of pantheism. So we can have this strong and rich sense of participation, but it's one that's understood in that particular context or framework. But then the difference then between God as God and human is much bigger than the difference between us and other creatures. So actually, if you have that Creatio ex nihilo framework, you're not becoming anthropocentric, you're becoming theocentric. And that should reduce this rather unfortunate anthropocentric interpretation of Christianity, which does, nevertheless, as you suggest, tend to dominate the discussion, not least in contemporary writings of theological anthropology. And there's one other point I want to make, and that is about the wisdom tradition itself. The wisdom tradition is also one which includes other creatures. Go to the ant and be wise. So it's a reflection on includes reflection on the natural world that's then incorporated into understanding of what the way we should be in relation to God.
So may I ask you, how do you interpret the Imago Dei in Genesis?
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, I see the Imago Dei as there are various ways of understanding it. One has tended to concentrate on what you might call key characteristics such as reason, freedom, and other characteristics or ontological understanding of who the person is. The other is more functional. I prefer to have an understanding of Imago Dei as performative. That is, we are about the way we perform in the theodrama is what gives us the image of God. So our relationship with others and the relationship with God and with other creatures becomes, and you could say in that sense, our co-participants in the drama is what brings forth the image of God. So that's the way we bear our image. But in a sense, there are prerequisites to that performance, and that is our capacities, which are distinct for humans, but they're not. It's not a way of. Our Imago Dei is not based on our separation or separative characteristics. It's based on how we perform in the theodrama. Do you understand why that's different from the standard? Yeah.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Ready for some questions? Did you want to turn to anyone else on this issue?
Yeah, maybe Jonathan Marks.
I would have thought Jonathan
Jonathan Marks
and
might come up.
Stephen would be.
Okay, great.
John Marks at the Institute for Advanced Study this year. Very interesting presentation, Celia. My question is actually, I think, a fairly small one. You identified symbol making as a science, and I stumble over that a little bit, because to me what I hear is that there is a method of obtaining a single correct objective meaning of a symbol, which doesn't strike me as really appropriate for understanding symbols, which I think are
No, I certainly didn't mean that.
Usually definitely different kinds of hermeneutic traditions for different understandings at different times and different contexts, which strikes me as very humanistic. And I was wondering if you could just
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons I raised that was because this, like much of anthropology, which I find completely fascinating, is that it draws on the biological sciences, but it also draws on the humanities. So it's in this borderline zone, which is, I think, is a zone which is much more compatible with theology than some of the other, what I would call hard sciences, which tend to portray themselves in different kinds of ways. I mean, Sandra Harding is speaking this afternoon on the view from nowhere, she calls it, which is the assumption that scientists used to have, that they could, as it were, be totally objective. Now, one of the reasons why I'm interested in participation, understood through theodramatics, is that it admits that we can never be in that view from nowhere. And she gave a list of the different alternatives that are now in science and I would have to go to her talk to find out exactly what she meant by those characteristics. But I think that there is an opening up even within the sciences to some maybe alternatives in the way that perhaps there wasn't some years ago. But when I talked about symbol making, I didn't mean it to be a wooden understanding or a single interpretation or anything like that. It was more that this kind of language seemed to be acceptable to use within the sciences in the way that that if you like, put a different kind of interpretation on what theology might be trying to do. I used it for that reason, and also because it's part of the fourfold inheritance mechanisms that Lamb and Jablonka have suggested are the four ways that we think about inheritance mechanisms, and one of them is symbol making. Now, I don't think they thought of symbol making in a wooden kind of way either. So it was that reference that I was using for that.
Our next question is Phil.
Over here, sorry. Phil Sloan. Celia, I very much enjoyed your talk. In fact, I was agreeing with most of it. But I think there's one issue, at least I'd like to see you explore a little bit more, because it seems to me we have two alternatives that have often been presented to us. One of them is to emphasize the radical distinction for various reasons, human dignity, human rights, whatever it is, radical distinction of human beings from simply the animal world. And this was something that Darwin seemed to very much break down and corrode. But the other option that I hear an awful lot of now is what I call the kind of Peter Singer arguments, speciesism, we have no special status because of evolutionary theory, so we should quit emphasizing any of this kind of distinction, human dignity, and so forth. And it seems to me we have to mediate between those, that I think that granted the biological continuities, which are obvious and which are implied by evolutionary theory, yet what is it that's different that actually makes this particular conversation itself possible and makes it something other than animal grunts and noises at one another? And I think that that's one of the things we have to think about theologically. Now, maybe you have. I know you and I have been a bit of discussion on this, but I'd like to have you flesh out a little bit more how you see distinction in continuity, or do you see distinction in continuity?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure Stephen Clark will have some words to say about this as well, but I think it's a mistake to see. I know that there are some, what I would call traditional Catholic theologians, that castigate Peter Singer and others on the basis that it somehow weakens human dignity. I think that's a mistake. In other words, I think it's a mistake to see that elevating the status of other animals somehow weakens our own sense of human dignity. So just because we widen our concern or care for other animals doesn't mean that we diminish our appreciation or value for human beings. The difference in Singer's case is that he has a particularly utilitarian understanding of philosophy that then renders a sentience incorporated into that understanding, so that human beings become measured up against sentience in other animals. But I don't think we need to follow that part of his philosophy. In other words, we can still value other animals without going down the particular route that he goes on, or refuse any sort of distinctions. I think what he objects to is a fixation on our species and not care about other creatures. But I think there are conversations now going on between him and Christian ethicists like Charles Camosium, for example, that shows that some of the. I mean, I don't agree with his way of doing ethics, but I think that the way that he's been used as an excuse to downgrade appreciation of other animals by Catholic theologians, or some traditional Catholic theologians, is a mistake. At the same time, I think that the puzzle of human distinctiveness is still there, and I prefer to use the language of distinctiveness rather than uniqueness. But I use that in the sense that there are certain characteristics of humans that are very, very different. And, of course, no other animals would be sitting around this table having these kind of conversations. That's obvious. So we can't just have a completely flat line between human beings and other creatures. And so on that basis, I don't want a completely flat moral playing field. But at the same time, we can enlarge our horizons. We can see that the human has a particularly distinctive role in the theodrama that other creatures do not have, going back to Douglas Hedley's comment at the beginning of this session. But at the same time, we don't need to be exclusive. So it's human exceptionalism and exclusivity that I want to push back against, rather than saying there's nothing distinctive about the human person, because clearly there are distinctive issues. Anthropologists are still working out what is it about the human that's different, and I would like to say that it's wisdom that actually helps to articulate some of that, and it's something that I'm involved with a research project with Augustin Fuentes at the moment, looking at the evolution of wisdom as a way of maybe trying to map, what that distinctiveness really means. So I'm certainly not saying that there isn't anything distinctive, and I'm not saying, but at the same time, I'm not saying that in order to get that distinctiveness, we need to somehow be exclusive or measure ourselves as superior in some way to other animals as a way of getting what that distinctiveness means. Because as Tim Ingold says, that way of doing it is not really about human beings as such. It's more about the human condition. So it's not about our human nature, in other words. It's about the human condition, because it's one particular framing of who we are that comes out of a particular Western cultural tradition, and therefore we should be wary perhaps of the ethnocentrism that's built into that way of thinking about things. So I would say that what I'm trying to do is a rewriting of the divine image, but we still are the image of God, and other animals are not the image of God. I know that some of my colleagues have pressed for the understanding other animals as the image of God as well as humans. I think that it's much better to think of other animals in the likeness of God rather. And that's another paper I could have written was on the human beings as the image and other animals as in the likeness. And I thought about doing something on that, but then I thought, well, this one is going to take quite enough time. So, and I have actually written something and published something on that already in Zygon. So that's probably enough answer to your question. But
Stephen, since Celia had raised the idea of your thoughts on this, would you like to jump in here?
I'm not quite sure. Oh, thank you. When I'm on record as very much in favour of elevating or recognising the moral status of the non-human, and I'm on record as not greatly caring for species divisions. I don't have any strong belief in species as morally relevant entities, or even as real entities. On the other hand, I just to put the other side, and for a moment, though we don't manage it very well, we do have some sort of idea of what justice between us, present-day humans, would be like. We don't manage it, but we have some idea of what it would be like. I don't think I have any clear idea of what justice between in the entire biosphere would be like, and I certainly have no idea how to achieve it. In fact, I rather fear that any attempt to achieve it would result in quite horrendous errors, and there would be an attempt to turn everything into a theme park, which most creatures we share the world with would resent deeply if they noticed we were doing it. So our business is with us, chiefly, and the best we can probably manage for the rest is to look after them when their needs become obvious to us, and refrain from interfering with them when they've got their own lives to live and we don't know how to do it for them. So in this, I'm actually rather on Chesterton's side. Chesterton says somewhere that a turkey is as alien and awful as an archangel. We have no idea what the turkey's life is, or how to help the turkey live a just and decent life after its kind. I think he exaggerated. I mean, he was, and in other cases he would certainly say we know very well what a lot of creatures would like to have, because we're just like them. We know what the dog wants. We know what the cat wants, for that matter. They make it very clear to us, and we can accommodate them. But so I'm not in favour, as I know one or two people of my other wise persuasion are, of a grand bio-egalitarianism, because I don't think it would work very well. I don't think we could make it work, frankly. I think so. I'm probably agreeing with you. Let's limit our ideals. Come the day, the wolf will lie down with the lamb, and the leopard and the young lion, and paddling together, and the little child shall lead them. But that's beyond us at the moment.
yeah,
Could I just carry on talking for a moment? Because I did actually have a sort of question before I got lumbered. I'm a bit uncertain about this creation ex nihilo stuff, and I'd quite like you to say a bit more about it. I mean, just to put it in my context, wearing my ancient philosopher hat, but certainly in the Timaeus, it's set up so that there is a sort of stuff of a deeply ambiguous kind, which in some way constrains what the demiurge can do, and constrains the extent to which perfection can possibly be measured in a material world. But most later Platonists thought that the Timaeus wasn't to be taken literally and chronologically. It wasn't that there was first of all some weird stuff that just happened to be there, and the divine creator had to deal with it somehow. It was that in analysing what there is, you come constantly up to there's a difference between the matter and the form of any given thing, and you come up as at the edge of analysis, you come up with, well, even earth can turn into water and fire, and there's the ultimate possibility of difference and distinction. And some of them went on to say, Plotinus went on to say, that it's in this possibility of difference and dissolution that you get evil. But that, put like that sounds fairly straightforward, doesn't it? I mean, it just says that things decay. Things decay and get in each other's way and so on. And this is why things don't always work together smoothly. Not because there's an underlying gunk, but because when you try to put perfection into time, they jostle up against each other and fall apart. And that's what evil is. That's all evil is. So that's my understanding of the pagan. But clearly some people have thought, and some ancient theologians, some patristic theologians thought that there was some real difference between the pagan and the Christian on this point, and I've never really quite seen what it was. And you, I think, perhaps do rather more than I do, so could you say a bit more about it?
Well,
Sorry, I've gone on too long, but that's my question.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert in Plato, so maybe I should defer to Douglas Hedley. So, but what I was using was the common understanding of the way Plato had been received. In other words, he'd been received as rejecting this understanding of Creatio ex Nihilo. And I think that there were reasons why theologians wanted to keep the notion of Creatio ex Nihilo, particularly to do with a sense of not wanting there to be something before God. In other words, there was a sense in which that God was the source of all things. So if there was something there other than God, then it somehow impinged on the sense of divine omnipotence. So, and I mean, there's a whole history of where it came into the into the tradition. Some people, I'm just looking at my notes here, it goes back possibly to the later half of the 2nd century. It's when it first started to becoming more popular. Although Gerard May apparently puts it earlier than that. But there are other scholars who've debated on the basis of the biblical record. The biblical record doesn't necessarily support something like Creatio ex Nihilo, but there are scholars, or Hebrew scholars, who say that it's still compatible with it. So there's a discussion about whether we should adopt something like this based on the biblical record. How far it's necessary to have based on Plato's original views, I don't feel confident to answer that. So I think I'd have to defer to.
I suppose my question is, I catched it wrongly. It wasn't really a question about the analysis of Plato. I was trying to find out what creation ex nihilo is supposed to convey. And if it means, as you just said, there's nothing before God, well, pagan agreed with that. If it means there's nothing constrains God. Well, is that literal? There's nothing constrained. God could make. We had this. It was discussed this morning, wasn't it? A bit. Yeah. Can God make any world? and that happens two ways. Is there a limit on as it were, how depraved a world he could make, and is there a limit on how great a world he could make? And I'm not sure that the pagans would certainly think, the Platonists would certainly think there's a limit on how depraved a world he could make. He couldn't make a depraved world, full stop. That's a nonsense.
Yeah,
but the best of, I'm not sure about the best world.
Yeah, I mean, I see it as a framework within which participation could start to make sense, rather than all that could be said about God. Because of course, Creatio ex Nihilo is just a starting point. And I would say that it's a starting point for thinking about God as absolute goodness, because you don't want to bring in, you know, a sense of the possible depravity of the world coming in through the action of God. I mean, the idea of nothing is non-being in a sense. So in other words, all being comes from God from the beginning. So I think I feel like I'm sort of delving into philosophical hot water that I not really feel confident to discuss in a way that I think you're pushing me to discuss. But I think that it's interesting because it provides an alternative to what I would call the temptation by many evolutionary biologists come theologians who've worked in this area to go for a kind of process view of God. And so it's setting up the contrast between the process view, which sees God as emerging through the world and in the world, and the idea of Creatio ex Nihilo, which puts this distinction there right from the very beginning. A clear distinction that, if you like, is like a marker of what God is like. But at the same time, it's not sufficient. So that's why I think you need to have an understanding of the Trinity. You need to have words about God in terms of love and wisdom and so on. So the Creatio ex Nihilo is more of a metaphysical framework. How adequate it is philosophically, that's something for philosophers to discuss. But it was one that was used by Augustine, taken up by Aquinas and so on. So it's been incorporated into tradition for hundreds of years. And I think that the dispensing with it by some contemporary theologians in order to make it more compatible with the evolutionary account is not necessarily a good idea. So, but I'd like to hear what Douglas has to say on maybe some of the intricacies of philosophical meaning that perhaps are behind the Creatio ex Nihilo.
Well, I suspect Stephen is being too much of a gentleman to press his point any harder, but but I mean, I think one of the agendas here is that the theologians often use Creatio ex Nihilo as a sort of ace in the pack. Yeah, so that they write this is this distinctively Christian solution to all problems, but that's very puzzling to someone. Well, like Stephen, who's a real expert in late antique thought, because Plotinus will say, well, you know, the world is theothen. Comes from the divine. You know, it's the one is the dunamis panton. He's the potentiality to all and of all. So that in that sense, the pagans and the Christians, I mean the Platonic pagans, not the Stoics, of course, and not the Epicureans, but the Platonists and the Christians share entirely this conviction that the physical cosmos is entirely grounded in the transcendent divine principle, and that generates for both of them the problems of, well, why is evil in the world, and you know, where does it come from? I think the other point that Stephen's raising, which is this interesting one, is maybe a deeper difference and tension, but here it's a tension, I think, between the more Hellenizing Christians and the anti-Hellenizing Christians, between, you know, if that first principle is good, then that goodness must, in a sense, however paradoxical, be constraining even for the supreme principle. Whereas there are those in the more anti-Hellenic tradition who've always said, no, divine sovereignty must trump any other principle, even goodness. This is, of course, linked to the Euthyphro question. So I suppose if I may be pushing Stephen's question harder than he would wish to put it, but the question here would be, how much work is creation out of nothing doing? That's fine if it's there against the process, theologian, but that in fact, considered in relation to the late antique context out of which it came, basically those Christians using this language, like Augustine, are sharing much more with their pagan contemporaries than they're actually disagreeing with them.
Yeah, I mean, I could have written a different kind of paper that looked at the misuse of Creatio and ex nihilo by Augustine, but I wasn't trying to do that. I was trying to bring us up to the contemporary era, and I don't feel that I'm not as interested in some of the ancient philosophical discussions as maybe other people in this room are, and someone else can take up that sort of mantle. But what I was trying to do was, and if it turns out that that particular view is shared by Plotinus and others, you could say, well, maybe it's not necessary to have it, because you can get around the problem in another way by drawing on some of these other writers instead. But what I wanted to do was to set up a contrast between, like I said, the emergentist view, which seems to be the most popular view amongst theologians interested in the biological scientists, and this other more transcendent view, which actually echoes or leaves room for this idea of participation. Yes. So I was trying to use it in that vein rather than looking into the details of whether Augustine's interpretation of Plato was correct, which from what you're saying it probably was not. But I haven't looked into that part of it myself. Now, whether I should take that bit out in the final version of this or whether I should add footnotes, I don't know. But I think that it's not really. I think the argument still holds in terms of what I was trying to suggest, in that that view of transcendence, which possibly is shared by Plotinus and others, sets up the possibility of forms of participation which will work within the biological sciences, which will work by analogy. Now, I don't know whether that's still...
Our next question is in the back. Brad?
Brad Gregory, the director of the Institute for Advanced Study. Terrific paper, Celia. Thank you so much. Douglas, for your comment. This is just a kind of a side note or a footnote on the issue of Creatio ex nihilo. David Bentley Hart, in his recent book, The Experience of God, spends a couple, I think, very good chapters talking about, if I understand his argument well, Creatio ex nihilo is a kind of corollary to the understanding of God or the ground of being, whatever you want to call it, is necessary in order to answer the question about ontological contingency. That is, you cannot keep pushing things back and back. It doesn't matter. Go back to quantum foam. Go back to the singularity. It is as far away from non-being as the world as we experience it today. And that means you've got to posit something that is utterly unlike anything that we know is part of the whole history of the contingently existing universe in order to account for it. And it can't be created out of anything because that would be something already contingently existent that you've got to explain the existence of to begin with. So that's the way that I found it a lucid attempt to make that argument in a contemporary setting, absolutely conversant with all the ancient sources, as well as Hart provocatively says then in the book. Platonism is just as compelling a philosophical position today as it was 2,400 years ago. It's just that it happens to be out of fashion. So in any case, that's the way that I want to understand it, and I wondered if either Celia or Stephen or Douglas would want to comment on that.
Well, I mean, it sounded from what you were saying that David Bentley Hart was basically reinforcing what I was trying to say. in that it's that the idea of any sort of emergent God just won't work in terms of Christian faith, and so therefore you need an alternative. And so on that basis, there is still a value for Creatio and ex nihilo of some kind. And I will check those chapters again, so I can maybe adjust some of the things I've said.
I'm sorry, I should have mentioned this as well. The interesting thing about Hart's argument is he's very careful to make it in no sense contingent on Christianity specifically. He thinks this applies not only to Christianity, but to Judaism, Islam, and indeed, he even makes the argument with respect to, once you understand mutatis mutandis was at stake for Hinduism and even Buddhism as well. So it's a very interesting argument that way.
Oh, I think he was right to plunder the Egyptians.
Yes, yeah. I mean, the part of the difficulty, of course, if you go into the history of some of these ideas, that would be a completely different kind of paper. But yeah, I think it's...
Other questions? Comments? Okay, since this is the last session, and instead of you getting the first word first, I'll get the first word, and then you'll really have the first word this time. Well, thank you very much for being a part of this Templeton Colloquium at the NDIAS. On behalf of the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study and for the University of Notre Dame, I would like to thank Celia, Deane-Drummond, and Douglas Hedley, our presenters. Thank all of you for your questions, your participation in this. We'd also like to again express our gratitude to the John Templeton Foundation. And with that, I will turn it over to Douglas with a small reminder for those who are having dinner tonight. It will be at 5:15 over in the Salon Ballroom. And now, Douglas, you really have the last word.
Well, thank you very much, Don. As is clear from the title, one of my interests in the colloquium is not just looking at the sources and the use, but also the contemporary relevance of this idea of participation. I think even in the last moments of this conversation, the relevance of a full-blown theory of divine transcendence been made evident in a particularly lucid and eloquent way by our speaker this afternoon. So I'd like to thank Celia Deane-Drummond for bringing not only the ecological and the scientific dimension into the discussion, which is such an important part of that relevance, but also highlighting a particularly important theological aspect of this topic. So thank you very much, Celia.